So here's something that I think is pretty important to go over. I think it will be kind of repetitive for a lot of you, but I think there may be some for whom this is important. So for completeness, I want to provide it. And what I want to talk about is just a couple different ways that we can run R code within the RStudio environment. One thing I'll mention at the outset here is that this is not specific to the RStudio environment. What I'm going to talk about here transfers just as well if you're using that default R interface that I showed a couple times in some of the other videos, but I like working in RStudio, so that's what I'm going to do here. And the first thing I want to mention is just that we have an interactive environment here in the console, and this is a place where you can type code and get immediate feedback on what you're doing. So this is a place where I can type things like paste hello world, and each time I hit enter here in the console, this line of code is going to execute. So this is a great place for testing code, with kind of getting familiar with the syntax and the language. If you're not sure what something does and you want to trial and error some things, this is a good method for doing that. This is not a method that a lot of practicing data analysts that I know use to develop R code. I think what generally tends to happen in research fields such as ours is that people bundle their code into scripts. So the way that we'll do that here is to create a new script, and a script is just a way for me to combine several lines of code. And the thing to notice here is that these lines of code don't execute as I hit enter. They're going to execute when I tell the development environment that I want the code to be executed. So I can bundle several lines of code here. I can read this Spotify top 50 data set in. I can make a plot. And so let's see. And when I have several lines of code that I'd like to execute at once in a script, what I can do is, first of all, I can execute this line by line. If I highlight a particular line, I can run it here. I use a keyboard shortcut. Generally on my Mac, it's a Command Enter, which will run a line of code. On my PC at work, I think it's a Control R. It's my keyboard shortcut. So I can run this line by line, but I can also run all of it at once. So, although I have to get my column titles correct. Which one is danceability? Yeah, I just didn't spell it right. And so if I source these lines, now I have 4 lines of code that work together to form a plot. And this is nice because a lot of times when we do things like this, we're doing them kind of iteratively, and we're adding to them. Maybe I'd like to change my x-axis, so I'd like this to be a little cleaner. And the real value of scripts is in promoting reproducibility and just avoiding repetition, in the sense that if I wanted to make a similar plot like this for many of my columns in the data frame, I could write the script once and then I could run it whenever I wanted to produce those plots, in contrast to running it in the console where I would have to type those things in, or at least copy and paste them each time I wanted to execute them. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to scripts. And then, of course, I can save this script to my project. I'm not going to do that now because I don't want to clutter up this project with an illustrative script. And the last thing that I want to touch on is a way that I'm going to be using a lot in the course to develop R code, which is a Markdown document. Okay, and a Markdown, an R Markdown, is a nice document type. Illustration. This is a nice document type that I've mentioned a few times that I really like using for teaching purposes because I can combine text-based narrative, longer text-based narrative with smaller code chunks. So I can embed code chunks in a text document to create kind of an illustration that has a long-winded explanation of what's happening and then some code chunks that provide an illustration. Okay, and so one thing that I should mention while I'm talking about that is that within a script, the way that I might annotate some code is using a hashtag. So I'd say this is a script that reads data and makes a plot. And this hashtag will tell R that this is not code that should be run, but rather an annotation to be ignored. And so when I source this, the hashtag tells R to ignore this line and run these lines. So this will run just fine and crank out my plot. Okay. And so these code comments are a pretty nice, it's nice to get in the habit of commenting your code, as most of you probably know through working in other platforms, that it helps people understand what you're doing if you're going to be sharing your code, and it kind of helps jog your memory for what you've done if you have some code that you're developing and then you set it aside for a week and come back to it. So sorry about that. I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but that's a code comment within a script. And then if we come back over here to the Markdown document, the Markdown document does not require that hashtag in order to write text into your document. You can just write normal text explanations for what you're doing, illustrations, and then you can embed code chunks using this R tag. In this case, the code chunk is named, so it has R cars, but I'll go ahead and show you just the basic code chunk here. Looks like that, 3 backticks and an R in brackets. And let's see, this is summarizing the cars data frame. So I'll put something in here that does something else to cars. How about filters cars? Okay, and within these Markdown documents, I do have a separate video on this, so there's a little bit more content if you want a deeper discussion of this, but within these Markdown documents, as you're developing them in the RStudio console, you can run the lines individually using the play button here in the top right corner. And so this is kind of like an interactive environment where you can run these chunks individually, but another thing that you can do with a Markdown document is that you can knit it, and when you knit the document, it's going to execute all of these code chunks, and it's going to collect the output and combine it with the text to create an output file. And here, this is the YAML header is designating this to render to an HTML document. So when we knit it, it's going to create a separate HTML document that combines this text with this code to make a document. So let's Markdown illustration. So again, we just go up here and we knit it. And when we knit this document, it creates an HTML document for us, which is kind of a nice little document that can be read top to bottom, where you can provide this text-based narrative, and you can combine it, and you can weave code chunks and data analysis output into a text document. Okay, so those are three ways that we can use primarily to develop R code, and hopefully that was a helpful illustration for at least one or two of you. Like I said, I know it will be pretty repetitive for a lot of you, but hopefully that illustration will provide some value to at least one or two people.